Hello, my friends. I'm glad you're here tonight. Before we begin, let me ask you a small question. Where are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? I always find it fascinating to imagine people scattered across the world. Some in the quiet of midnight, some in the early morning, perhaps with rain against the window or the faint hum of a city outside. Wherever you are, let's step together into a different time, into the past, into a world at war. Now picture this. Britain, September 1939. The announcement had just been made on the radio. Britain was at war with Germany. People stopped in their kitchens, in their shops, in pubs with their pints halfway raised. For a moment, silence. And then, a low murmur across the country. A mix of fear, duty, and the heavy awareness that nothing would be the same again. Our story begins with one young man among millions. His name was Thomas Bennett, though everyone called him Tom. He wasn't a particularly remarkable man, not at first glance. 22 years old, from a small town in Kent, the son of a railway worker. He liked football, had a younger sister who adored him, and dreamed of one day traveling beyond the English coast. He never imagined his first great journey would be into war. When the war was declared, Tom was already part of the Territorial Army, the part-time soldiers who trained on weekends. That meant he was called up almost immediately. Within days, he was packing his kit bag, saying goodbye to his mother, and stepping onto a train crowded with young men just like him. Some were laughing to hide their nerves, others sat silent, staring out the window as green fields passed by, fields they might never see again. Tom would later remember the smell of that train. Damp wool uniforms, tobacco smoke, the faint scent of oil on rifles that had been hurriedly handed out. He carried a Lee Enfield rifle, the standard weapon of the British Army, heavy but reliable. It would become almost like a limb to him over the coming years. Their first stop was basic training, though for many it was more about discipline than learning. Marching in formation, polishing boots until they reflected like glass, learning to set up tents in the rain. Tom remembered endless lectures on gas masks, because the memory of the First World War was still alive in every officer's mind. Mustard gas had haunted the previous generation, and everyone believed the Germans would use it again. Soldiers were drilled over and over, how to put on the mask in seconds, how to carry it everywhere. Many joked about it, but no one dared be without it. What was it like, really, to be a young soldier then? Imagine long days filled with uncertainty. The war had started, yes, but there were no battles yet for most of them. This early period was sometimes called the phony war. Months of waiting, of rumors, of preparing without fighting. Tom would write in his diary, which we'll return to again and again, about the strange tension of those days. "We are at war," he wrote in October 1939, "but I have yet to fire a shot. It feels like standing in the eye of a storm, knowing the wind will come." There were moments of boredom, endless cleaning of rifles, drills repeated until muscle remembered more than the mind. And yet, under it all, a kind of restlessness. What would come next? Where would they be sent? The officers gave no answers. One evening, as Tom sat with his mates around a small fire, one of them told a rumor he had overheard, that they might be shipped to France soon. Another claimed they would defend the coast of Britain against invasion. Another laughed and said the war would be over by Christmas, just like the last time. That line, "over by Christmas," was repeated so many times it became almost a bitter joke. None of them knew that the war would stretch on for years, longer and harsher than many could endure. Tom's first posting came in early 1940. His unit boarded a ship across the Channel, landing in France to join the British Expeditionary Force. The crossing itself was gray and uneventful, the sea calm, though every soldier scanned the horizon for enemy aircraft. They disembarked near Le Havre, a bustling port city filled with French soldiers, British lorries, and a sense of uneasy calm. The Germans had not yet attacked in force. The life of a soldier in France was, at first, strangely quiet. They dug trenches, patrolled villages, shared cigarettes with French farmers, and tried to keep spirits high. Tom was struck by how beautiful the countryside was. The orchards, the narrow roads lined with trees, the smell of fresh bread drifting from bakeries. It was hard to believe a war was unfolding. And yet, at night, the sky would sometimes hum with distant aircraft, and searchlights would sweep the dark. Tom carried his rifle everywhere, even when visiting the small estaminets, local cafes where soldiers could buy wine, bread, and sometimes, if they were lucky, eggs. He learned a few words of French, enough to say bonjour and merci, though often laughter erupted when he mispronounced something. Those were small moments of humanity, little pockets of warmth before the storm broke. Because the storm did come. In May 1940, Germany launched its lightning attack through the Low Countries and into France. Everything changed almost overnight. Tom would later write in his diary, "It was as if the whole world had burst open. Planes roared overhead, tanks rolled across fields, refugees flooded the roads. The quiet days were gone, replaced by chaos. But that, my friends, is a story we will move deeper into as we go along. For now, imagine Tom, the young man from Kent, standing with his rifle on the edge of a French field, listening to the first thunder of war moving closer. His life, and the life of millions, was about to be swept into history. The spring of 1940 began with a deceptive calm. For months, Tom and his fellow soldiers had lived a strange existence in northern France. They drilled, patrolled, repaired vehicles, and dug defensive positions that never seemed quite finished. Some men joked that they were gardeners with rifles, spending more time with shovels than bullets. The French countryside seemed almost too peaceful, green and blooming with spring. And yet, everyone knew that the Germans were waiting. On the morning of May 10th, it began. News spread quickly through the British camps. Germany had launched a massive attack. It was not a slow push, but a sudden lightning strike. Tanks, aircraft, and infantry moving with terrifying speed. The word blitzkrieg began to circulate among the soldiers, a German term that meant lightning war. Tom had never seen anything like it. The first sign for his unit was the sky. German bombers swept overhead, the dull drone of engines growing louder until the ground shook. Anti-aircraft guns fired, tracers streaked across the clouds, and explosions echoed in the distance. Refugees filled the roads, entire families carrying what little they could. Carts pulled by horses, bicycles loaded with blankets, mothers holding crying children. Tom would never forget those scenes. War was no longer a distant possibility. It was here, and it was brutal. The British Expeditionary Force moved quickly, trying to hold defensive lines alongside their French and Belgian allies. Orders came in fragments. Hold this bridge, retreat to that village, dig in here until further notice. Tom and his comrades marched endlessly, often with little sleep, the sound of artillery growing ever nearer. One night, they bivouacked in an orchard, the blossoms falling silently around them while flares lit the sky like artificial stars. Tom lay awake, listening to the distant rumble of tanks. What was it like for the soldiers in those days? Imagine the constant uncertainty. One moment they were ordered to dig trenches, the next to abandon them. Rumors flew faster than messengers. That Paris had fallen, that the Germans had been stopped, that reinforcements were coming. None of it seemed reliable. The only truth was the thunder of guns and the endless streams of civilians pushing westward. Tom began to see things that would stay with him forever. A farmhouse burned on the horizon, smoke curling black against the blue sky. A line of soldiers trudged past, their faces gray with exhaustion. Once, he saw a boy no older than his sister trying to push a bicycle loaded with pots and blankets, tears streaking his dusty cheeks. The soldiers wanted to help, but they had no time. Orders were orders. The British lines collapsed faster than anyone had expected. German tanks, the feared panzers, sliced through the Ardennes forest, a place many believed was impassable. Suddenly, the Allied armies were cut off, surrounded, forced to retreat toward the coast. The word on everyone's lips became Dunkirk. For Tom, Dunkirk was still only a name on a map when his unit began to retreat northward. But the journey itself was a nightmare. Long marches on crowded roads, aircraft strafing from above, villages abandoned in panic. One day, as they marched through a small town, Stukas appeared. The German dive bombers that screamed as they fell. Tom threw himself into a ditch, the earth trembling as bombs exploded nearby. The sound of those sirens would haunt him in his dreams for years. When the dust cleared, part of the town was rubble. He remembered the eerie silence afterward, broken only by the crackle of flames and the moans of the wounded. Still, the retreat went on. The soldiers carried only what they could. Food was scarce, water often muddy from roadside wells. Yet, in those bleak days, bonds of brotherhood grew strong. Tom and his mates shared every scrap, every cigarette, every joke they could muster. Humor became a shield against despair. One soldier quipped, after nearly being run over by a tank, "Well, that's one way to get home early." Laughter burst out, ragged but real. At night, they huddled in barns or under hedges, too tired to care about comfort. Tom wrote in his diary, "We march by day, we collapse by night. My feet bleed, I have lost track of the days. But somehow we keep moving." He sketched a rough drawing of a road lined with refugees, little stick figures carrying bundles. Even in exhaustion, he wanted to remember. By late May, the situation was desperate. The British Expeditionary Force, along with thousands of French and Belgian troops, was trapped near the northern coast. Dunkirk became not just a name, but their only hope. The word spread like fire. The Navy was coming, ships would take them home. At first, many refused to believe it. The Germans were so close. Could an evacuation even succeed? And yet, rumors persisted. Soldiers whispered about fishing boats, about yachts and ferries, even about little pleasure crafts from England braving the Channel. Tom felt a flicker of hope, though he tried to suppress it. Hope in war could be dangerous, but deep down, every man prayed it was true. As they approached Dunkirk, the scenes grew even more surreal. Columns of soldiers stretched for miles, boots clattering on cobblestones, rifles slung over weary shoulders. The beaches came into view at last. Endless sand, and beyond it, the gray-blue sea. And on that sea, smoke rose from burning ships, and the thunder of artillery echoed. The Germans were closing in. Tom would never forget his first sight of the beach. Tens of thousands of men crowded there, waiting, lines stretching into the distance. The sea was dotted with ships of every size, some burning, some ferrying men to larger vessels offshore. Aircraft swooped down, bombs exploding in sand and surf. Yet still, the lines held. Soldiers queued patiently, as if waiting for a train, while chaos erupted around them. That was Dunkirk, a place of terror and of miracle, a place where history shifted. For Tom, it was the crucible of his youth, the moment he truly understood what it meant to be at war. But his journey was far from over. The beaches of Dunkirk were only the beginning of a much longer story. The beaches stretched endlessly, a flat expanse of pale sand bordered by dunes on one side and the restless channel on the other. Tom had seen beaches before, as a boy on summer holidays, but never like this. Here, tens of thousands of soldiers crowded together, their khaki uniforms blending into a sea of waiting men. Lines snaked down toward the surf, men standing ankle-deep in water, rifles slung, helmets tilted low against the sun. It was not the lively seaside of his childhood, but something grim, desperate, and strangely disciplined. Tom and his comrades were directed toward a section of beach near La Panne. Their officer, a tired man with a voice hoarse from shouting, told them simply, "Stay together, wait your turn, keep your kit with you." And so they waited. At first, the atmosphere seemed almost calm. Soldiers sat on their packs, smoked cigarettes, shared what food they had left. Some dozed in the sand, exhausted beyond caring. Others sang quietly, the tunes of old marching songs, voices carrying faintly above the surf. Tom remembered watching a group of men sketching in the sand with sticks, drawing crude maps or writing names. It was a strange mixture of boredom and dread, as if everyone balanced on the edge of something they could not fully grasp. Then the Stukas came. The German dive bombers screamed down from the sky with their sirens wailing, a sound that made every hair on Tom's neck rise. The men scattered instinctively, diving into shallow trenches or pressing flat against the sand. Bombs exploded along the beach, fountains of sand and smoke rising into the air. The noise was deafening, the shock waves rattling teeth and bones. Tom hugged the ground, heart pounding, the acrid taste of dust in his mouth. When the attack ended, dozens of craters pocked the beach. A column of smoke rose from a ship just offshore, flames licking its decks. And then, almost unbelievably, the men stood up again. They brushed sand from their uniforms, picked up their rifles, and returned to their places in line. There was no panic, only a grim acceptance. Tom would always remember that, the quiet resilience of men who knew they might die waiting, but who waited anyway. Life on the beaches became a strange rhythm of fear and endurance. The soldiers built makeshift shelters from wreckage, dug shallow foxholes in the dunes, scavenged for food and water. Sometimes, French villagers appeared with carts, offering loaves of bread, bottles of wine, even apples. These small gifts felt like treasures. Tom bit into an apple one afternoon, the sweet juice running down his chin, and thought it was the finest thing he had ever tasted. Nights were the hardest. Fires burned along the horizon where ships had been hit, the glow reflecting off the low clouds. The sound of distant artillery rumbled like a storm, and flares drifted down, casting ghostly light across the beach. Men huddled together for warmth, telling stories to pass the long hours. Tom's friend, a lad from Manchester named Harris, spoke of the factory where he used to work, of a girl he hoped to marry. "If I get out of this," Harris said one night, "first thing I'll do is buy her a ring. Proper gold. None of that cheap stuff." Tom listened, nodding, though neither of them knew if Harris would ever have the chance. The waiting stretched for days. Rumors spread constantly. More ships were coming, the Navy had given up, the Germans were about to break through. Each morning brought new uncertainty. The men joked bitterly that the beach itself was their new home. One soldier scrawled "Hotel Dunkirk" on a bit of wreckage and propped it in the sand. Humor, once again, kept despair at bay. Then, at last, it was Tom's turn. His unit was ordered to form up and march toward a makeshift pier. A long line of lorries sunk into the surf, planks laid across them to form a path out to sea. From there, small boats ferried men to larger ships waiting offshore. The sight was both chaotic and miraculous. Fishing trawlers, tugboats, pleasure yachts, even lifeboats, all manned by volunteers from Britain, moved back and forth across the channel. Together, they formed what would later be called the Little Ships of Dunkirk. Tom stepped onto the makeshift pier, the wood slick beneath his boots, the sea splashing up against the sides. He clutched his rifle, gripping it as if it were the only solid thing in the world. Ahead, a small boat bobbed in the waves, crewmen shouting for soldiers to climb aboard. Behind him, the line pressed forward, thousands waiting their chance. When his turn came, Tom scrambled down into the boat, nearly slipping but caught by a strong hand. They packed in shoulder to shoulder, the boat rocking dangerously as it pulled away. Tom looked back once at the beach, a vast sprawl of khaki still waiting under the distant thrum of aircraft. He felt a pang of guilt. Why him and not the others still standing there? But the moment passed quickly as the boat pitched in the waves. Reaching the larger ship was no less terrifying. They clambered up nets slung over the side, the sea slapping against steel, the air filled with smoke and the constant roar of engines. Tom's hands were raw by the time he hauled himself over the rail, collapsing on deck among hundreds of other exhausted men. The ship shuddered as it pulled away, its decks crowded with soldiers packed so tightly they could barely move. And then, for the first time in weeks, Tom felt something like relief. The coastline of France receded into the distance, dark and smoldering, while the gray expanse of the channel stretched before them. The journey was not safe. German aircraft still prowled the skies, and ships were sunk even in those final miles. But the sight of England on the horizon would be burned into his memory forever. When they landed back on British soil, Tom staggered down the gangway, boots clattering on the dock. Civilians stood waiting, offering tea, bread, even cigarettes. Some wept openly at the sight of so many young men returned. Others cheered, waving flags. For Tom, it was overwhelming. He felt both proud and hollow, saved and yet burdened by the memory of all those left behind. The evacuation of Dunkirk was not the end of the war. It was, in truth, only the beginning. But for Tom, stepping once more on the familiar soil of home, it felt like a miracle. He had survived when survival had seemed impossible. And yet, even as he sipped the hot tea pressed into his hands, he knew the war would call him again. When Tom set foot back on English soil, there was no time for rest. Civilians cheered, volunteers handed out food, and newspapers called the evacuation a miracle. But Tom knew better. Dunkirk had not been a victory. It had been survival, pure and simple. He and thousands of others had escaped, but much of their equipment had been left behind. Rifles, trucks, artillery, even tanks, all abandoned on the beaches. Britain was suddenly vulnerable, and every soldier knew it. For a few days, Tom was sent to a camp in southern England. He remembered the strange mix of exhaustion and relief that clung to everyone. Men lay sprawled in their tents, boots off, staring into nothing. Some tried to joke about the ordeal, but their laughter rang hollow. Others wrote letters home, trying to put into words what they had seen, though most gave up after a few sentences. How could you explain Dunkirk to someone who hadn't been there? Tom spent hours cleaning his rifle, though he had fired it only a handful of times in France. The Leon field felt heavier in his hands now, as if it carried the weight of every moment he had survived. He wondered if he would soon need to use it again, not on foreign soil this time, but here at home, because everyone believed the Germans were coming. After France fell in June 1940, Britain stood alone. Hitler's armies controlled most of Western Europe. The next logical step, everyone thought, was an invasion across the Channel. Posters went up warning citizens to be ready. Beach defenses were built, pillboxes dotting the coastline, barbed wire strung along the sand. The Home Guard was formed, older men and volunteers too young or too old for the regular army, patrolling with makeshift weapons and a fierce determination. Tom was reassigned to a unit stationed along the southern coast. His days were filled with patrols, drills, and the endless construction of defenses. He helped drag obstacles onto the beaches, set up machine gun nests, and study maps of likely landing sites. There was a constant tension in the air. Every night, men looked out over the dark channel, half expecting to see the silhouettes of invasion barges. But before the Germans could cross the water, they needed to control the skies. And so began what would later be called the Battle of Britain. It started with raids on shipping, then on airfields. Tom often looked up from his post to see dogfights unfolding high above. Tiny specks twisting and diving, engines roaring, machine guns rattling. The Royal Air Force was the shield of the nation, and every man on the ground watched their duels with both fear and awe. One afternoon in July, Tom was on guard duty when a German bomber formation passed overhead. The sound was unlike anything he had heard, low, steady, like a rolling drumbeat. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire, black puffs of smoke dotting the sky. Then, suddenly, Spitfires appeared, slicing upward with incredible speed. Tom and his mates cheered instinctively, fists raised, as the British fighters tore into the bombers. The battle raged across the sky, engines howling, planes diving and climbing. One bomber fell in flames, spiraling down until it crashed in a distant field. The men stood silently then, the cheers fading, aware of the violence they had just witnessed. Life on the ground was a mixture of routine and sudden terror. Sirens wailed almost daily, warning of incoming raids. Sometimes the bombs fell far away, dull thuds echoing in the distance. Other times they fell close. Tom remembered one night when a nearby village was hit. His unit rushed in to help, pulling survivors from rubble, carrying the wounded to makeshift aid stations. The smell of smoke and dust clung to his clothes for days. Among the ruins, he saw a child's doll lying in the street, its face scorched. That image never left him. Despite the destruction, the spirit of the people held firm. Civilians carried on with remarkable resilience. Shops reopened the morning after raids. Women queued for rations as if nothing had happened. Children played in bombed-out streets. Tom admired them deeply. "We are all soldiers now," he wrote in his diary, "whether we wear uniforms or not." During those months, Tom grew close to his comrades. They shared everything: cigarettes, letters from home, even boots when one pair wore out. Harris, the young man from Manchester who dreamed of buying a ring for his sweetheart, became Tom's closest friend. They often talked late into the night, lying in their bunks, voices hushed. Harris would describe the streets of his hometown, the smell of the mills, the way his girl laughed. Tom would speak of Kent, of the railway yard where his father worked, of his sister who always begged him to bring back chocolate. These conversations were small lifelines, reminders of the world beyond the war. By late summer, the bombing intensified. London became the primary target. Though Tom was stationed further south, his unit was sometimes sent to assist after heavy raids. He saw the capital in flames, entire streets reduced to rubble, yet still alive with determination. Firefighters battled blazes through the night, wardens guided people into shelters, and in the morning, life went on. It was during this period that Prime Minister Churchill gave his famous speech about their finest hour. The word spread quickly among the soldiers, a rallying cry that reminded them why they fought. For Tom, the Battle of Britain was both terrifying and inspiring. He felt the fragility of life with every air raid, yet also the unshakable strength of his country. Britain had not fallen. Against all odds, the RAF had held the skies. The invasion never came, and yet, Tom knew this was only one chapter. The war stretched ahead, long and uncertain. For now, though, he stood on the cliffs of southern England, looking out over the calm waters of the Channel, and felt a strange mixture of relief and anticipation. The fight was far from over. By the autumn of 1940, the immediate danger of invasion had passed. The skies above Britain still roared with aircraft, bombs still fell, but there was a sense that the worst of that chapter had been endured. For Tom, however, the war was not slowing. It was changing direction. Orders came that his unit would be redeployed. The enemy, it seemed, was no longer just across the Channel. Italy had entered the war on Germany's side, and fighting had broken out in North Africa. The deserts of Egypt and Libya, places Tom had barely heard of, suddenly became the next great battlefield. The British Army was being reinforced there to defend vital routes and, above all, the Suez Canal, a lifeline of empire, connecting Britain to its colonies and allies. Tom was going to war in the desert. The journey itself was an adventure of its own. In early 1941, Tom boarded a troopship, its decks crowded with soldiers, crates of supplies, and the restless chatter of men about to cross the world. For many, it was their first glimpse of the wider globe. They sailed south past Gibraltar, through seas where German U-boats prowled. Convoys of ships moved together, guarded by destroyers that sliced the waves like sleek hounds. At night, the convoy sailed blacked out, no lights to betray their position. Tom lay on deck under the stars, the sky vast and unpolluted, stretching forever. He thought of home, of Kent's quiet fields, and wondered if he would ever see them again. When they landed in Egypt, the shock was immediate. Heat pressed down like a weight, the sun blinding against the sand. Tom had grown up under gray English skies. Here, the air shimmered with mirages, the landscape a sea of dunes and rock. Cairo was a bustle of noise and color, filled with markets, smells of spices, and the cry of street vendors. Soldiers stared wide-eyed, trying to take it all in, though soon enough, they were marched out into the desert, far from the city's comforts. Life in the desert was unlike anything Tom had ever experienced. The days were scorching, the nights freezing. Sand found its way into everything: rifles, boots, rations. Water was rationed more carefully than food, and men learned to sip slowly, every drop precious. They lived in tents when possible, but often just under the open sky, their blankets spread on the hard earth. Flies tormented them by day, scorpions sometimes crept into boots at night. Yet, through it all, they adapted. Soldiers are quick learners when survival depends on it. The enemy, too, was adapting. At first, the British fought mostly Italian forces, who were poorly equipped and often demoralized. Victories came quickly: villages captured, prisoners taken, tanks abandoned in the sand. Morale rose, and Tom felt the confidence of a soldier who believes momentum is on his side. He wrote in his diary, "It almost feels like we are chasing shadows. The desert is vast, but the Italians melt away before us." But then came the Germans. In early 1941, news spread through the camps of a new arrival: General Erwin Rommel, leading the Afrika Korps. His reputation grew like wildfire. Soldiers whispered his name with both respect and fear. Rommel moved fast, using tanks and mobile units with a skill that caught the British off guard. Suddenly, the desert that had seemed so empty erupted with battle. Tom's first real clash with the Germans came near Tobruk. He remembered the sandstorms as much as the gunfire. Great walls of dust that blotted out the sun, choking lungs and blinding eyes. In the chaos, tanks loomed out of the haze like monsters, their guns booming, shells exploding in fountains of earth. Tom fired his rifle until his shoulder ached, the recoil numbing his arm. The sound of machine guns rattled. Men shouted, and the desert echoed with violence. What struck him most was the speed. In France, the fighting had been desperate but often disorganized. Here, in North Africa, battles shifted like the tide. One day, his unit advanced miles into the desert. The next, they were forced to retreat just as far. Camps were abandoned, supplies lost, positions swapped again and again. It was a war of movement, exhausting and relentless. Yet, amid the struggle, there were moments of strange beauty. At dawn, the desert could be breathtaking. Pale light spilling across endless sand, the silence profound. At night, the stars stretched wider than anywhere Tom had ever seen. Soldiers sometimes sat quietly, staring upward, their fears momentarily forgotten. Harris once joked, "If we weren't being shot at, this place would be a paradise for dreamers." Tom smiled at that, though he doubted paradise had so much dust. Supplies were always a problem. Rations often meant tins of bully beef and hard biscuits, tough enough to break teeth. Water trucks were guarded like treasure, and every soldier learned to wash with just a handful of drops. Vehicles broke down constantly, engines clogged with sand. Mechanics became as vital as marksmen, keeping trucks and tanks alive in the unforgiving terrain. And through it all, the sense of comradeship deepened. The men relied on each other not just for survival, but for sanity. They shared jokes, songs, and the occasional packet of tea. Tom once received a small parcel from home, a bar of chocolate, wrapped carefully by his sister. He broke it into pieces and passed it around, the sweetness a rare luxury. Harris took his bite and said, "That's worth more than gold out here." The campaign dragged on, battles ebbing and flowing across the desert. Sometimes they cheered victories, sometimes they mourned losses. But Tom began to realize that this war would not end quickly. It was a test of endurance as much as courage. One evening, after a long day of marching, Tom sat on a ridge of sand and looked out at the setting sun. The horizon glowed red, shadows stretching long. He thought of Kent, of his family, of the quiet life that seemed so distant now. "If I live through this," he wrote in his diary, "I will never again complain about rain or cold. England may be gray, but it is home. Out here, the world feels endless, and the war feels endless too." The desert was teaching him hard lessons. But his journey was far from finished. Ahead lay battles fiercer still, sieges, retreats, and the relentless push toward victory. By the spring of 1941, the Desert War had shifted into something far harsher than the soldiers first imagined. The British had advanced deeply into Libya, only to be driven back again by Rommel's counterattacks. Villages and outposts changed hands like tossed coins. The name that came to define this period for Tom and thousands of others was Tobruk. Tobruk was a port city on the Libyan coast, a crucial supply hub. Whoever controlled it could keep their armies supplied across the desert. For Rommel, it was a prize. For the British, it was a fortress that had to be held at all costs. And so, when the Germans encircled the city, Tobruk became a siege. Tom's unit was among those ordered to defend the perimeter. The defenses stretched in a rough ring around the city. Trenches, barbed wire, minefields, and gun positions dug into the hard earth. It was not glamorous. The trenches were shallow, the wire often thin, the sand constantly shifting in the wind. Yet they were expected to hold. Life in Tobruk became a cycle of waiting, enduring, and sudden bursts of terror. The days were scorching, the heat bouncing off the sand and stone. Men dug deeper into the earth, carving out shelters called dugouts, where they could escape the sun. These dugouts became homes, crude, dusty holes lined with bits of wood or tin. Tom shared his with Harris and two others. They kept a small tin can as a stove, heating water for tea when they could. Harris even painted a sign over their dugout entrance. The Kent Club, a nod to Tom's home. It was a small act of humor in a place where laughter was scarce. The Germans shelled the perimeter daily. Artillery roared, shells whistling overhead before crashing into the lines. The ground shook, dust rising in choking clouds. Tom grew used to the sound, though each explosion still made his stomach clench. At night, the shelling sometimes continued, flashes lighting the horizon like distant lightning. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by blasts or the scurrying of rats that infested the trenches. Food was meager. Rations were mostly tinned bully beef, biscuits, and occasionally bread baked in makeshift ovens. The men joked bitterly about the monotony, calling it bully beef surprise, no matter how it was served. Water was rationed more strictly than ever. A man might be allotted a single canteen for an entire day to drink, wash, and shave with. Most gave up washing altogether, their faces smeared with dust, their uniforms stiff with sweat. And yet, amid the hardship, the defenders earned a nickname, the Rats of Tobruk. The Germans meant it as an insult, mocking the way the soldiers lived underground in dugouts and tunnels. But the British embraced it, wearing the name with pride. They were rats, yes, but rats that refused to be driven out. Tom remembered one particular night when German tanks probed the lines. The air was filled with the rumble of engines, the clatter of tracks on stone. Flares burst overhead, bathing the desert in ghostly white light. Tom crouched in his trench, heart hammering, rifle clenched tight. Machine guns opened up, tracer rounds streaking across the sand. The tanks fired, their shells tearing craters into the earth. Yet the line held. When dawn broke, several enemy tanks lay smoking on the battlefield, their hulks blackened. The defenders cheered, weary but defiant. In quieter moments, life returned to a strange normal. Soldiers swapped stories, played cards, even organized makeshift concerts with harmonicas and improvised drums. Letters from home were read and reread until the paper wore thin. Tom treasured each one from his mother and sister, their words grounding him in a world beyond the siege. He wrote back as often as he could, though he spared them the worst details. "I am well," he would begin, even when exhaustion gnawed at his bones. One evening, after a long day of shelling, Tom and Harris sat outside their dugout, watching the sunset bleed across the desert. The sky was painted in shades of orange and purple, the silence almost peaceful. Harris lit a cigarette, passing it to Tom. "Funny, isn't it?" Harris said. "We're living like moles, eating worse than rats, and still the sun sets like this. Almost makes you forget." Tom nodded, taking a drag, the smoke harsh in his lungs but strangely comforting. The siege dragged on for months. Disease became as much an enemy as bullets. Flies swarmed over everything, food, wounds, even the sleeping men. Dysentery spread quickly, weakening many. Medical supplies were scarce, and the field hospitals overflowed. Tom saw comrades waste away, their faces gaunt, their strength gone. Yet somehow the defenders endured. For Rommel, Tobruk was a thorn in his side. Time and again he launched attacks to break the fortress. Time and again the Rats of Tobruk held. Each failed assault cost the Germans dearly, buying time for the Allies to regroup. By late 1941, relief finally came. British forces launched an offensive, pushing back the Germans and lifting the siege. When the news spread through the dugouts, cheers erupted. Men embraced, laughed, some even wept openly. Tom felt a surge of pride unlike anything before. They had endured the unendurable and emerged still standing. Yet, as he packed up his kit and prepared to march again, Tom knew the war was far from over. Tobruk was a victory, yes, but only one in a long, grinding struggle. Ahead lay more deserts, more battles, and perhaps, one day, another return to Europe. For now, though, he carried the memory of Tobruk like a badge. He was a rat, and proud of it. After Tobruk, Tom thought perhaps things might ease. The siege had been so intense, so unrelenting, that he imagined the worst must now be behind them. But war rarely granted such mercy. No sooner had they celebrated the lifting of the siege than the next chapter of the desert campaign unfolded. The desert was vast, and armies moved across it like waves. Tobruk had been saved, but the Germans and Italians regrouped quickly. Rommel, tireless and cunning, struck again in 1942. Once more, the British were pushed back, fighting retreat after retreat. For Tom, it felt like being caught in a tide. Advance a little, retreat a little more, dig in, fight, move again. The days blurred together in the desert heat. Long convoys wound across endless sand, dust clouds rising behind them. Vehicles broke down often, stranding men until mechanics could coax engines back to life. The supply lines stretched thin, and water remained precious. Sometimes Tom went to sleep with lips cracked, his canteen already drained. Other times, he licked condensation off a tin cup just for a taste of moisture. Yet amid this hardship, there was something different now, a sense that the tide could be turned. Reinforcements were arriving. Fresh divisions, better tanks, more aircraft. Tom noticed the difference immediately. Gone were the rattling old trucks and flimsy equipment of the early days. Now, new Shermans rumbled across the sand, and Spitfires streaked the sky. The men still joked about bully beef, still cursed the flies, but behind their words was a growing belief. Maybe they could stop Rommel. One of Tom's closest memories from this period came during a long, tense march eastward. His unit had been ordered to hold a defensive line near Mersa. The sandstorm that blew through was so fierce it turned day into twilight, the air thick with swirling grit. Men wrapped scarves over their mouths, goggles over their eyes, stumbling blindly. Vehicles stalled, engines choking on dust. In the eerie half-light, Tom stumbled beside Harris, their boots sinking into drifts of sand. "Feels like marching on the moon," Harris muttered, and Tom laughed despite himself. The desert, he realized, was as much an enemy as Rommel's army. At Mersa they fought hard. German armor punched at their positions, artillery roaring, planes screaming overhead. Tom remembered crouching behind a low wall of stone, firing his rifle at figures darting across the sand. The battle was chaos. Explosions, smoke, men shouting orders half lost in the din. In the end, they withdrew again, but not in panic this time. It was a fighting retreat, controlled, measured, and it led them to a place that would soon become legendary: El Alamein. El Alamein was little more than a railway stop along the coast of Egypt, but its geography made it vital. To the north was the Mediterranean. To the south stretched the impassable Qattara Depression. Between these lay a narrow corridor, only 40 miles wide, through which the entire desert war now funneled. If Rommel broke through, the road to Alexandria and the Suez Canal would be open. If the British held, they could finally stop him. The men dug in along the line, preparing for the storm. Trenches, minefields, gun emplacements, all were laid out under the blazing sun. Tom worked until his hands blistered, his uniform stiff with sweat. "Feels like we're building the edge of the world," Harris said one evening, looking out at the miles of barbed wire stretching into the horizon. The battles around El Alamein came in waves. First, Rommel struck in July 1942, trying to break through quickly. Tom's unit faced a night assault, tracer fire streaking across the darkness. the boom of artillery shaking the ground. Tom fired until his shoulder ached, reloading in the dim glow of flares. When dawn broke, the battlefield was littered with wreckage. Burning tanks, twisted wire, the sand stained dark. They had held. Barely, but they had held. Between battles, life settled into a strange rhythm. The desert at night was cold, the stars brilliant overhead. Tom often lay in his trench staring at the sky, the Milky Way stretching like a river of light. "Hard to believe there's a war under that," he whispered once. Harris chuckled beside him. "The stars don't care. They've seen it all before." There were lighter moments, too. Soldiers brewed tea in battered kettles, their laughter carrying across the lines. Someone found an old gramophone, and for a brief evening, music drifted over the desert. Scratchy but sweet, a tune from home. Tom closed his eyes, imagining a dance hall in Kent, the smell of polished floors and fresh air, far from dust and death. But the war always intruded. Rumors spread constantly. Rommel was out of fuel, Rommel was reinforced, the Americans were coming, the end was near. No one knew what to believe. The only certainty was the next attack. Tom began to feel the strain deep in his bones. The months of desert war had carved hollows in his face, his skin toughened by sun and wind. Harris joked he looked like an old man, though he was barely 23. In truth, Tom sometimes felt older still, the weight of constant battle pressing down on him. And yet, something kept him going. Perhaps it was pride, the belief that holding this line mattered. Perhaps it was comradeship, the bond forged in shared hardship. Or perhaps it was simply stubbornness, the refusal to give ground after so much had already been sacrificed. As the summer dragged on, both sides gathered strength for the decisive clash. Tom could sense it coming in the air. The quiet before a storm, the waiting, the endless drills and preparations. When it came, he knew it would be unlike anything before. And so, under the burning sun of Egypt, Tom waited at El Alamein, unaware that history itself was about to pivot on the sands beneath his boots. The weeks before the great offensive at El Alamein felt like the longest of Tom's life. Every soldier sensed it coming, something vast, something final. The desert seemed to hold its breath. Convoys of trucks rolled in daily, unloading supplies in staggering quantities. Crates of ammunition, endless jerrycans of fuel, stacks of rations piled high under camouflage nets. Everywhere Tom looked, there were signs of preparation. The British Eighth Army, now under the command of General Bernard Montgomery, was transforming before their eyes. Montgomery had arrived with confidence that radiated through the ranks. He told them plainly, there would be no retreat, no giving ground. They would hold and then they would attack. His speeches were brief but firm, and men like Tom felt a new determination settle over them. It was not bravado, it was clarity. Still, the waiting gnawed at Tom. Each day they drilled, checked weapons, patrolled the lines. Each night he lay awake in his trench, staring at the stars, imagining what would come. Harris muttered about it often, unable to keep his nerves in check. "It's going to be bloody, Tom. You know it. They say thousands of guns are lined up. Whole desert's going to shake." He wasn't wrong. The British and their allies had amassed one of the largest concentrations of artillery the desert had ever seen. Over 1,000 guns stood ready, barrels pointed toward Rommel's positions. Tom had seen some of them during the build-up, rows upon rows of heavy pieces, their crews waiting like coiled springs. Then came October 23, 1942. The night was cool, a crescent moon hanging over the desert. At exactly 9:40 p.m., the world erupted. A thunderous roar rolled across the line as every gun fired in unison, the horizon flashing with fire. The ground shook beneath Tom's boots, his ears filled with the deafening crash of shells. It was as though the desert itself had come alive with fury. Tom clutched his rifle, peering into the darkness where the bombardment rained down. "Bloody hell," Harris whispered beside him, voice trembling. For hours, the guns hammered away, tearing at minefields, shattering enemy defenses. The sky glowed red, smoke drifting across the stars. Then came the order, advance. Tom's battalion moved forward, bayonets fixed, hearts pounding. Ahead lay the German minefields, layered with traps and barbed wire. Engineers worked desperately to clear paths, sweat dripping as they probed for mines under the deadly glare of flares. Every few minutes, an explosion marked where someone had stepped wrong. But the line kept moving, steady and relentless. The night became chaos, shouts, explosions, tracer fire whipping overhead. Tom stumbled across the sand, rifle ready, his mind focused only on keeping up with the men around him. Somewhere to his left, Harris was cursing as he crawled through wire, the two of them pushing forward inch by inch. By dawn, they had gained ground, but at a cost. Tom saw men he knew lying still in the sand, faces pale in the morning light. Yet there was no time to stop. The battle raged on for days, the desert filled with smoke, dust, and the roar of engines. Rommel's Afrika Korps fought fiercely. Their tanks counterattacked again and again, sleek machines maneuvering across the desert with deadly precision. Tom watched British Shermans and German Panzer IVs clash in duels that seemed almost unreal. Steel monsters circling, shells slamming, plumes of fire erupting. Sometimes a tank would burn for hours, its flames visible for miles. Through it all, Tom endured. He dug new foxholes under fire, carried ammunition until his shoulders ached, and fired his rifle until the barrel burned hot. He ate when he could, slept in snatches, and lived with the constant thunder of battle in his ears. There were moments of strange beauty. At night, when the guns paused for a brief lull, the desert was illuminated by burning wrecks, glowing like fallen stars. The silence in those moments was haunting, broken only by the crackle of flames. Tom would sit in the sand, too tired to speak, watching the horizon shimmer with heat and smoke. As the days stretched on, the pressure on Rommel grew. Supplies were scarce for the Germans, fuel in particular. Tom heard whispers that convoys from Europe had been sunk, leaving the Afrika Korps stranded. "They're running on fumes," Harris said one night, his grin wide despite exhaustion. "This is it, Tom. We've got them." Montgomery launched his final push in early November. Once again, the sky lit with artillery, and once again Tom found himself charging forward, bayonet fixed, shouting with a voice he barely recognized as his own. They smashed through minefields, overran strong points, and pressed into the heart of Rommel's line. And then, at last, the Germans began to break. Tom could feel it, a shift in the air, a faltering. Prisoners streamed back, their faces haggard, their uniforms dust-stained. German vehicles lay abandoned, engines silent. For the first time, Tom dared to believe they were winning. On November 4th, the Afrika Korps began a full retreat. Tom stood on a rise overlooking the battlefield, the sun blazing above, and saw columns of enemy vehicles stretching into the distance. Dust clouds rose as they fled westward, chased by British armor. Harris came up beside him, his face smeared with grime, eyes wide with disbelief. "We did it. Bloody hell, Tom, we did it." The victory at El Alamein was more than just a battle won. It was a turning point. For Tom, it was proof that the tide of war could shift, that defeat was not inevitable. He thought of home, of his family, of the countless letters he had written without knowing if he'd survive to send them. Now, at least he felt hope. Still, there was no time for celebration. Orders soon came to pursue Rommel across the desert, deeper into North Africa. The war was not over, it was changing shape. Tom tightened his pack, adjusted his helmet, and prepared once more to march. As the long column set out westward, he looked back one last time at the battlefield of El Alamein. The desert was scarred with craters, littered with wreckage, silent but for the crackle of distant fires. It would be remembered forever. And for Tom, it was the place where he first believed he might one day see the end of the war. The victory at El Alamein left the desert strangely quiet. For weeks, Tom had lived in a storm of fire and noise, and now the silence felt almost unnerving. But the war did not end there. Orders came quickly. Pursue Rommel's retreating army westward, deeper into North Africa. The men of the 8th Army shouldered their gear once more, and the endless march began. Tom had imagined pursuit as something fast, almost exhilarating. Instead, it was a grind. The desert was vast beyond comprehension, stretching mile after mile in empty silence. Every day, convoys of British and Commonwealth soldiers rumbled forward, kicking up massive clouds of dust that hung in the air like fog. Vehicles broke down constantly, their engines choked by sand, and Tom often found himself pushing trucks under the blazing sun. "Feels like we're chasing ghosts," Harris muttered one afternoon as they trudged across the dunes. The Africa Corps left little behind but wreckage. Burned tanks, abandoned trucks, shattered guns lying rusted under the relentless sun. Sometimes Tom would see personal items scattered among the debris. A torn blanket, a boot, even a photograph fluttering in the wind. They were reminders that the enemy, too, were just men enduring the same hardships. The pursuit was not without danger. German rearguards fought tenaciously, ambushing convoys and laying mines across the desert tracks. One morning, as Tom's unit advanced, a loud explosion shattered the air. An armored car hit a mine and erupted in flames. The column halted instantly, engineers rushing forward to clear the path while everyone else scanned the horizon nervously. The desert offered no cover, only wide, open exposure, and Tom's skin prickled as he imagined enemy gunners watching from a distant ridge. There were also air raids. The Luftwaffe, though weakened, was far from finished. Stukas swooped down suddenly from the blazing sky, their sirens wailing, bombs kicking up towering plumes of sand. Tom threw himself flat into the burning dust more times than he could count, clutching his helmet as the ground shook beneath him. The British Spitfires and Hurricanes fought back, chasing the enemy planes across the sky in deadly spirals, but the sense of vulnerability never truly left. As the army advanced, they passed through places Tom had never heard of: Mersa Matruh, Tobruk, names that would be etched forever in his memory. Some towns were little more than ruins, their buildings shattered by months of bombardment. Others still held civilians, thin and weary, who watched silently as columns of soldiers passed through their streets. Children sometimes waved hesitantly, and Tom would toss them a biscuit from his rations, though guilt gnawed at him knowing it was nowhere near enough. By December, the men were exhausted. The distances covered were staggering hundreds of miles across harsh terrain. Tom's boots wore thin, his uniform stiff with sweat and dust. Nights were bitterly cold, a cruel contrast to the daytime heat. He and Harris would huddle in their blankets, trying to sleep as the wind howled through the desert. Harris, always restless, would whisper stories about home, about pubs in London, about music halls, about food. "Imagine a proper roast, Tom," he'd say with a grin, "with gravy, potatoes, and maybe a pint or two." Tom would smile, but the ache of longing was sharp. He thought of his mother's cooking, of the quiet fields of England, of the sound of rain against the window. Those things felt like they belonged to another life. In January 1943, the 8th Army reached Tripoli. The city, once a jewel of Italian North Africa, had been abandoned by the retreating Axis forces. The streets were eerily quiet, buildings scarred by bombings, harbors choked with sunken ships. Tom walked through the city in disbelief. It felt almost like a ghost town. Yet, for the British, it was a moment of triumph. The Union Jack was raised over the city, and Montgomery himself marched in at the head of the army. The men cheered, their spirits lifted by the sight. For a brief moment, it felt like victory was truly within reach. But Rommel was not finished. The Africa Corps retreated into Tunisia, where rugged mountains and narrow passes replaced the open desert. There, the Germans prepared to make their final stand in Africa. Tom quickly learned that the terrain would be as much an enemy as the soldiers they faced. The mountains of Tunisia were a shock after months of desert. The ground was rocky, broken, filled with valleys that could hide entire armies. Ambushes became frequent. German artillery, hidden in the hills, rained shells onto advancing columns. Tom and his mates were forced to climb steep ridges under fire, sweat pouring as they scrambled for cover. The weather, too, turned against them. Winter storms swept across Tunisia, drenching the soldiers in cold rain. The dry desert dust became sticky mud, clinging to boots and wheels, bogging down vehicles. Nights were freezing, and Tom found himself shivering in his damp uniform, longing for the burning sun of Egypt. Yet even amid the misery, there were moments of camaraderie. Around campfires, men sang songs to keep spirits alive. Tom joined in, his voice hoarse but steady, the shared music a balm against the darkness. Harris, ever the storyteller, spun tales so ridiculous that the men laughed until their sides hurt. For a little while, they could forget the war. The fighting grew fiercer as they pushed deeper into Tunisia. German tanks, dug in behind ridges, clashed with British armor in brutal battles. The air was filled with the whine of aircraft, the crash of artillery, the desperate cries of men charging through mud and smoke. Tom fought through villages reduced to rubble, fields scarred by craters, olive groves shattered by shells. In one village, Tom stumbled upon a small church, its roof blown open, sunlight streaming through the broken beams. Inside, a single wooden cross still stood above the altar, untouched amid the wreckage. He paused there, breathing heavily, the smell of smoke and dust thick in the air. For reasons he couldn't quite explain, the sight gave him strength. Perhaps it was proof that something, however small, could endure. By March 1943, the Allies were closing in on Rommel's forces from both east and west, the Americans and Free French advancing from Algeria, the British pressing from Egypt and Libya. The noose was tightening. Tom knew the end in Africa was near, but he also knew the Germans would not surrender easily. As he cleaned his rifle one evening, Harris nudged him with a grin. "Word is, the Yanks got a bloody nose at Kasserine, but they'll learn quick. And when they do, well, Tommy boy, we'll finally push these blighters out of Africa for good." Tom nodded, though he felt a knot in his stomach. The war had taught him one thing above all. Victory always came at a price. And in Tunisia, the cost would be steep. By the spring of 1943, the war in North Africa had reached a fevered pitch. Tom and his unit had endured months of relentless marching, firefights, and constant exposure to sun, sand, and rain. The desert was behind them, replaced by the jagged hills and valleys of Tunisia, where every ridge could conceal enemy tanks or artillery. The Allies were closing in on the remaining Axis forces, but victory would not come easily. Tom's battalion advanced through narrow passes, the terrain making progress painfully slow. Vehicles struggled through mud, wheels stuck in clay that replaced the familiar desert sand. Soldiers slipped on steep slopes, their boots torn and uniforms muddied. Enemy snipers took advantage of every ridge, every crumbling wall, every abandoned house. Tom learned to move with his head low, eyes scanning constantly for the flash of a rifle barrel or the glint of a scope. One night, as they camped in a ravine, Harris pulled out a tattered pack of playing cards. "Keep your minds from turning to mush," he joked. The men gathered around, shuffling and dealing under the dim light of a lantern. For a few hours, laughter replaced the ever-present tension. Tom caught himself smiling for the first time in days, the simple joy of the moment a stark contrast to the constant danger surrounding them. But there was no escape from reality. The Germans had fortified key positions, laying mines across roads and installing machine gun nests in ruined villages. Each advance required careful planning, reconnaissance, and the courage to charge into the unknown. Tom learned to trust his instincts, to read the desert-like contours of Tunisia, and to move silently even when the world around him erupted in gunfire. The fighting intensified near the town of Mejez El Bab. The British and American forces coordinated for the first time in earnest, converging on Axis positions from multiple directions. Tom's unit was tasked with a frontal assault on a well-fortified hill. They moved under the cover of darkness, crawling through mud and rubble, hearts pounding with every muffled explosion and distant shot. At dawn, the attack commenced. Artillery thundered, shaking the ground beneath Tom's feet. He fired his rifle continuously, ducking into craters and shell holes. Harris was beside him, shouting encouragement, his voice barely audible over the cacophony. Tanks rumbled up the slope, their engines growling, while German panzers responded with deadly precision. Explosions threw sand and stone into the air. Smoke and dust mingled, reducing visibility to almost nothing. Hours seemed like days. Tom felt the exhaustion in every muscle, the ache in his back from carrying gear, the burning in his lungs from dust and smoke. Yet the battalion pushed on, inch by bloody inch. Men fell, some to wounds, others never to rise again. Each victory was paid for in sweat, blood, and the quiet grief of those left behind. During a brief lull, Tom surveyed the battlefield. The hill was scarred with craters and littered with debris. Bodies, both friend and foe, lay strewn, yet somehow the ridge had been taken. Tom felt a surge of relief mixed with sorrow. Victory always carried a shadow. Harris clapped him on the shoulder. "Bloody hell, Tom. We made it. But there's more to do." Supplies were once again a critical challenge. The mountainous terrain slowed convoys, and fuel was rationed tightly. Rations were basic hard biscuits, tinned meat, and the occasional tin of jam. Water remained precious, carefully distributed so that every man had just enough to drink and wash sparingly. Tom had grown used to scarcity, but each ration felt like a small victory in itself. The push continued westward. The Allies systematically captured key towns, isolating the remaining German units in pockets. Resistance stiffened as the enemy realized the noose was tightening. Tom and his comrades endured ambushes, mortar fire, and artillery barrages as they moved from ridge to ridge, from village to village. Yet with every success, the Axis forces grew weaker, their supply lines cut, their morale faltering. By late April, the campaign was nearing its climax. Tom could sense it in the air, the desperation of the enemy, the confidence of the Allies, the weariness and resilience of his own battalion. Final assaults were launched on key positions, coordinated with naval and air support. Planes strafed enemy columns, while artillery pounded defensive lines relentlessly. Tom felt the rumble through the ground, every shell echoing in his chest. The last stronghold fell in early May. German and Italian soldiers surrendered in large numbers, their faces a mixture of fatigue, despair, and relief. Tom watched as columns of prisoners were marched to holding areas. He noticed the exhaustion mirrored in their eyes. Men who, like him, had endured months of relentless combat, now reduced to submission. As the dust settled, Tom allowed himself a moment to breathe. The North African campaign, brutal and relentless, was over. Months of heat, cold, exhaustion, and fear had culminated in a hard-won victory. The Allies had pushed Rommel's forces out of Africa, securing the Mediterranean and opening the path for the invasion of Europe. Yet for Tom, the war was far from over. The battles in Tunisia had hardened him, leaving scars visible and invisible. He carried memories of friends lost, towns destroyed, and the endless struggle across deserts and mountains. But he also carried a renewed sense of purpose, a belief that perseverance, courage, and unity could turn the tide of history. As he looked west toward the horizon, where the Mediterranean shimmered in the afternoon sun, Tom realized that the end of one campaign was simply the beginning of another. North Africa had tested him in every way imaginable, but the war had many more trials in store. With the North African campaign finally behind him, Tom allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. The months in the desert had left him leaner, hardened, and wary, but also grateful for every day survived. Letters from home had piled up during the fighting, and for a few nights, he read them under a faint lantern glow, savoring news of family and distant streets he longed to see again. Yet the respite was brief. War, as always, pressed forward. Orders came for the next phase, the invasion of Sicily. The Allies were determined to strike the Axis heart in southern Europe, and Tom's unit was to be part of the amphibious assault, codenamed Operation Husky. Preparation involved long marches to embarkation points, inspections of vehicles and equipment, and endless briefings. Tom studied maps carefully, tracing the jagged Sicilian coastline, imagining the challenges ahead. Mountains rising abruptly from the sea, narrow roads winding through villages, and towns still occupied by enemy troops. Boarding the transport ships brought a mix of anxiety and anticipation. The Mediterranean gleamed under the sun, deceptively peaceful, hiding the danger beneath its surface. Tom stood at the rail, feeling the waves sway beneath him, the wind whipping through his hair. Around him, soldiers joked and tried to ease tension, but the quiet fear was palpable. They all knew that landing on Sicily would be a different kind of battle, one of water, cliffs, and civilian towns. The crossing was long, with nights spent rocking gently on the waves. Tom and Harris huddled on deck, the smell of salt and engine oil thick in the air. They watched the horizon, and sometimes imagined themselves stepping onto dry land at last, though they knew the enemy awaited. Stories circulated about mines, enemy ships, and coastal defenses. Each rumor heightened their awareness, sharpening instincts honed in the deserts of North Africa. Finally, the day came. Landing crafts descended into the surf, and Tom felt his heart race. Waves lashed against the hulls, the smell of salt thick in his nostrils. He gripped his rifle, eyes fixed on the approaching shore. Beach obstacles loomed ahead. Wooden stakes, metal wire, and the ever-present threat of artillery. Soldiers shouted orders over the roar of the surf, and the landing crafts jolted forward, hammering against waves as engines roared. As they hit the shallow water, Tom felt the cold surge around his boots. He waded toward the beach, boots sinking into sand and shells, each step deliberate, each movement measured. Behind him, the crafts disgorged more men, their shouts mingling with the roar of distant gunfire. Mortars pounded near the cliffs, and the occasional tracer round arced overhead. Sicily was beautiful in a cruel, deadly way. The sun glinting on the turquoise sea, olive trees clinging to hillsides, and villages perched like gems on the slopes. The fighting was chaotic and relentless. Axis forces defended the beaches with stubborn tenacity, and Tom found himself navigating through smoke, sand, and the cries of comrades. Harris shouted as a shell exploded near a dune, throwing sand into their faces. They moved forward, ducking behind rocks, firing when possible, dragging wounded men to safer ground. Each village captured felt like a small victory, each ridge taken a hard-fought step toward the island's interior. Life in Sicily tested Tom in new ways. The terrain was treacherous. Steep mountains, narrow roads, and dense forests made movement difficult. Vehicles struggled to climb hillsides, and supply convoys were slow, constantly threatened by enemy ambushes. Food was better than in the desert, but still basic. Tom learned to savor even small comforts. A piece of fresh bread from liberated villages, warm soup from field kitchens, or a sip of wine offered by civilians who cautiously emerged to see the soldiers. Civilians were everywhere. Men, women, and children watched from windows or rooftops, some cheering the Allies, others wary or fearful. Tom noticed their cautious curiosity and occasional smiles. It was a reminder that the war was not just about battles and bullets. It affected entire lives. In one small village, an old woman pressed a small loaf of bread into his hands. "For your journey," she whispered. Tom bowed his head in thanks, realizing that kindness could exist even amid destruction. The Axis resistance in Sicily proved formidable. German and Italian troops were well equipped, using natural terrain to their advantage. Snipers hid in ruins, artillery positions struck from elevated hillsides, and counterattacks forced Tom and his unit to adapt quickly. Ambushes were common, and every ridge or grove could conceal danger. Tom relied heavily on his experience from North Africa, using cover, moving in small teams, and constantly scanning for threats. Despite the intensity, there were fleeting moments of normalcy. Soldiers sang quietly as they marched, shared stories of home during brief rests, and even found time to play cards or write letters. Tom clung to these moments, savoring them like small anchors in a stormy sea. Harris often teased him about being sentimental, but Tom didn't care. Each smile, each laugh, was a defiance against the constant threat of death. By the end of July 1943, the Allies had secured Sicily. German and Italian forces had retreated to the Italian mainland, leaving the island in Allied hands. Tom stood atop a ridge, looking out over rolling hills, olive groves, and villages still marked by battle. He felt both relief and exhaustion. The campaign had tested every limit, physical, mental, and emotional, but it had also forged bonds, sharpened instincts, and deepened resolve. For Tom, the war was far from over. The mainland of Italy awaited, with new battles, harsh winters, and towns filled with civilians caught in the crossfire. But he felt prepared, shaped by deserts, mountains, and beaches into a soldier who had seen the extremes of endurance. As he surveyed the horizon, he allowed himself a brief thought of home, of Kent's green fields, of familiar streets, of family he longed to see again. And then, as orders came to move toward the coast for the next assault, he tucked those thoughts away, focusing on the road ahead. Italy was next, and with it, a new chapter of fire, courage, and survival. After the grueling Sicilian campaign, Tom and his unit embarked once again, this time for the Italian mainland. The Mediterranean shimmered beneath the transport ships, deceptively serene. For Tom, the calm was unsettling. He knew all too well that beauty often masked danger. Months of battle in North Africa and Sicily had taught him to expect the unexpected, and Italy would prove no different. They landed near Salerno in September 1943, under the code name Operation Avalanche. The beaches were narrow, the water shallow, and the enemy waited. Artillery fire struck sporadically, sending plumes of sand and debris into the air. Tom waded ashore, the familiar mix of salt water, mud, and tension gripping him immediately. His boots sank into the wet sand, and the first salvos reminded him that the war's intensity had followed him across the sea. The Italian terrain was unlike anything Tom had seen before. Hills rose abruptly from narrow valleys, forests clung to mountainsides, and rivers carved treacherous paths through villages. Movement was slow and exhausting. Supply lines creaked under pressure, vehicles jammed on rocky paths, and men constantly struggled against mud, rain, and fatigue. Every village taken seemed to come at a cost. Artillery fire, mines, snipers, and the constant threat of counterattacks. Tom quickly realized that Italy demanded a different kind of endurance. The mountains were unforgiving, forcing soldiers to climb slopes under fire, carry heavy gear over rocky ground, and navigate paths that twisted like a serpent through dense vegetation. He relied on skills honed in North Africa, but the Italian terrain tested his muscles and nerves in new ways. Harris complained constantly about the steep climbs, joking that their legs were being replaced with lead weights. Tom laughed, though exhaustion clawed at him with every step. The enemy was well entrenched. German forces, retreating from Sicily, fortified towns and ridges with clever ingenuity. Mortars, machine guns, and hidden artillery made every advance perilous. Tom's unit often moved in small teams, using cover, stealth, and careful coordination to take positions. In one memorable assault on a village perched on a hill, Tom crawled through rubble while Harris provided covering fire. Every doorway, every shattered wall could conceal danger. They pressed forward inch by inch, finally securing the village after hours of grueling combat. The psychological toll was heavy. Towns were filled with civilians, old men, women, and children caught in the crossfire. Tom witnessed fear etched into their faces, and he was struck by the quiet courage of those who stayed, providing food or shelter when they could. In one instance, a young boy guided Tom and Harris to a safe path around a minefield, smiling shyly before disappearing into the rubble. These small acts of humanity offered a strange comfort amid the chaos. Supply shortages persisted, though Italian towns offered occasional relief. Fresh bread, vegetables, and even fruit were sometimes available, a stark contrast to the monotonous rations of North Africa. Tom learned to appreciate these small luxuries. A warm meal, even modest, became a treasured morale boost. Field kitchens worked tirelessly, preparing meals for soldiers who had marched and fought through mountains and valleys for hours on end. Sleep was sporadic and shallow. Trenches in Italy were often little more than shallow holes, lined with stones or debris, offering minimal protection from rain and cold. Tom huddled with Harris during freezing nights, sharing blankets, teeth chattering as wind tore through the valleys. Despite exhaustion, they remained vigilant. Snipers and artillery were constant threats, and complacency could mean death. The battles pressed on relentlessly. Every ridge, every valley, every village became a microcosm of war. Booming artillery, gunfire, smoke, and the ever-present cries of men charging forward. Tom grew accustomed to chaos, but each day brought fresh challenges. Injuries, fatigue, and the weight of responsibility for comrades' safety were constant burdens. Yet through it all, camaraderie held strong. Soldiers shared stories, improvised games, and quiet moments of reflection. The bonds forged in North Africa and Sicily deepened further under Italian skies. Tom also learned the strategic importance of patience in this campaign. Unlike the open desert, Italy's rugged terrain slowed advances, making calculated assaults necessary. Reconnaissance was vital, and every hilltop, forest, and valley required careful planning. He watched commanders coordinate artillery, infantry, and armor with precision, learning that victories here depended on both courage and strategy. By late autumn, the Allies had secured footholds in central Italy, but progress was measured and slow. Tom could see the determination in every soldier's eyes. They had endured deserts, mountains, and beaches, yet the war still pressed forward. Every step brought them closer to the ultimate goal: breaking through the German defensive lines, liberating towns, and advancing toward Rome. Amid the hardship, Tom clung to hope. Letters from home, fleeting smiles from civilians, and moments of quiet reflection reminded him why he fought. The Italian campaign would be brutal, but he was ready. Months of North African deserts, Sicilian beaches, and mountain valleys had forged him into a soldier capable of enduring almost anything. And as the winds of winter swept through the Italian hills, Tom readied himself for the battles ahead, battles that would test courage, resolve, and humanity in ways he had never imagined. The Italian hills were relentless. Tom and his unit pressed forward through narrow valleys, rocky slopes, and villages scarred by constant fighting. The mountains forced a slower, more deliberate pace than anything Tom had experienced in North Africa or Sicily. Every step carried risk. Hidden mines, snipers, and fortified German positions awaited around every bend. Exhaustion was constant, but the drive to push forward never waned. The weather added a new layer of challenge. Rain fell in sheets, turning trails into slippery mud rivers. Tom's boots squelched in waterlogged trenches, and cold seeped into his bones despite layers of clothing. Nights were the harshest. Huddled in makeshift shelters, he and Harris shivered together, teeth chattering as wind howled down the valleys. Even brief moments of rest were uneasy, filled with tension over the next engagement. The enemy proved cunning and resilient. German forces had established multiple defensive lines, using the terrain to their advantage. Machine guns nested in ruined buildings, artillery positions perched on ridges, and snipers hidden in groves turned each village into a trap. Tom learned to move slowly and deliberately, coordinating with his team to flush out defenders and secure each objective. In one memorable assault, his unit crawled through shattered orchards under heavy fire, clearing houses room by room. Every step was earned through grit, patience, and courage. Civilians became a constant presence, their lives intertwined with the battlefields. Tom witnessed fear, resilience, and quiet bravery in the faces of men, women, and children caught in the crossfire. In a small mountain village, an elderly couple offered what little they had to the soldiers: bread, a warm fire, and shelter for a night. Tom marveled at their courage, knowing that the war had upended every routine, every comfort, and yet some continued to care for strangers amidst chaos. Supply lines struggled to keep pace with the army's advance. Trucks bogged down in mud, horses carried equipment where vehicles could not pass, and rations were often rationed down to the last biscuit. Fresh food was scarce, though local villages occasionally provided small relief, vegetables, fruit, or eggs. Each meal was cherished, a small comfort amid relentless combat. Tom developed a routine of carefully rationing what he had, learning to appreciate the simplest sustenance. Combat remained constant, and exhaustion weighed heavily. Days blurred into nights filled with the roar of artillery, gunfire, and the cries of men charging under fire. Tom grew accustomed to chaos, but the emotional toll was profound. Friends fell, some wounded, others killed, leaving shadows in the sand and mud where they had stood moments before. Harris was quick with humor to lighten the mood, yet even he could not hide the weariness creeping into their ranks. Despite the hardships, the Allies continued to press forward. Each village captured, each ridge secured, brought them closer to breaking the German defensive lines. Tom relied heavily on lessons learned in North Africa and Sicily. The value of cover, careful reconnaissance, and steady coordination with comrades. Survival was a combination of skill, timing, and sometimes sheer luck. The winter of 1943 to 1944 was particularly brutal. Snow dusted the peaks of higher hills, ice-coated river crossings, and soldiers struggled to keep warm in soggy uniforms. Frostbite became a genuine threat, alongside the ever-present risk of enemy fire. Tom found himself constantly vigilant, scanning the hills, rivers, and forests for signs of German movements. The harsh conditions tested not only physical endurance but mental resilience as well. Amid the struggle, Tom witnessed moments of humanity and levity that sustained the men. Soldiers shared stories from home, sang quietly around small fires, or improvised games to keep morale from collapsing. Letters from loved ones arrived sporadically, and reading them became a treasured ritual, a brief escape from the grim realities surrounding them. Harris often teased him about tearing up over the letters, but Tom ignored the jibes. Each word from home reminded him why he endured. The campaign pressed on, and the army steadily advanced. German positions were gradually outflanked or overrun, yet progress was measured and slow, a testament to both the enemy's skill and the challenging terrain. Tom learned patience and persistence, understanding that in Italy, every step forward was earned with effort, planning, and sacrifice. One evening, as they rested on a hilltop overlooking a small town, Tom reflected on the journey so far. From the deserts of North Africa to the beaches of Sicily and now the hills of Italy, every campaign had tested them in unique ways. The men were stronger, wiser, and bonded through shared hardship. Yet the war remained unyielding, demanding everything from each of them. The Italian campaign would continue to challenge Tom, through fortified towns, treacherous passes, and winter storms, but he had adapted. The experiences, the losses, the fleeting moments of respite, and the bonds of camaraderie had shaped him into a soldier capable of enduring almost any trial. As the night settled over the hills, Tom readied himself for the battles ahead, knowing that each ridge conquered was a step closer to victory, yet also a reminder of the cost it demanded. The Italian landscape grew ever more unforgiving as Tom's unit pressed northward. The rolling hills gave way to steeper mountains, narrow valleys, and river crossings that slowed even the most determined advances. Supplies were stretched thin, and the winter rain turned every path into a mudslide. Soldiers trudged forward, boots sinking into the slick earth, carrying heavy packs and rifles, each step a test of endurance. The objective became clear: Monte Cassino. The abbey perched atop a rocky hill dominated the surrounding valleys, a fortress of stone that the Germans used as a linchpin for their defensive lines. Every approach was met with sniper fire, artillery shells, and hidden machine gun nests. Tom knew this battle would be different from anything he had faced in North Africa or Sicily. It was slower, more methodical, and required every ounce of patience and skill. The days leading to the assault were tense. Reconnaissance parties scouted paths through narrow gorges and along cliff edges, carefully noting enemy positions. Tom spent hours crawling through mud and brush, avoiding patrols, and observing German defenses from concealed vantage points. Each report mattered, as the commanding officers planned a coordinated offensive combining infantry, artillery, and air support. Finally, the offensive began. The roar of artillery shook the valleys as British, American, and Polish forces opened fire. Tom and his unit advanced cautiously, using shell craters, rocks, and ruins as cover. Tracer rounds streaked across the misty hills, and explosions threw mud and stone into the air. Every village, every ridge, every grove became a battlefield. Tom could hear the shouts of men around him, the crack of rifles, and the distant roar of tanks moving through the valleys. The Germans were relentless. Machine guns nested in ruined walls, artillery positions hidden in gullies, and snipers picked off soldiers moving across open ground. Tom's unit had to fight inch by inch, clearing each house, each street, and each ridge before moving forward. One memorable engagement involved a narrow valley lined with olive trees. Enemy fire raked the ground as Tom and Harris crouched behind rocks, exchanging shots with hidden snipers. The olive trees, once symbols of peace, became deadly cover for the defenders. Night brought little respite. Soldiers dug shallow trenches or huddled in ruined buildings, listening to the wind whip through broken windows and the occasional distant shell. Sleep was fitful, filled with dreams of friends lost and the uncertainty of the next day. Harris often joked to lighten the tension, but even his humor could not mask the exhaustion that clung to everyone. Supplies remained a challenge. Rations consisted of hard biscuits, tinned meat, and whatever could be carried in packs. Water was rationed, often lukewarm, and men shared it carefully. Tom learned to cherish small comforts: a hot sip of tea, a piece of chocolate, or the rare fresh vegetables scavenged from a liberated village. These small things provided brief solace in the relentless grind of battle. As the offensive continued, the Allies faced stiff resistance. The Germans knew the terrain intimately, using every natural advantage to slow the advance. Tom learned to move silently, coordinate with his comrades, and anticipate enemy tactics. Every ridge cleared was a victory. Every village secured a step closer to breaking the German line. The civilian population was caught in the crossfire. Villagers hid in basements, watched from broken windows, or fled along muddy paths. Tom saw their fear and resilience, and he marveled at their ability to endure. In one village, a young girl offered him a piece of bread, her eyes wide with curiosity and fear. Tom accepted it gratefully, realizing that humanity persisted even amid devastation. After weeks of grueling combat, the Allies slowly gained ground. Villages were taken, ridges secured, and German defenses weakened by constant pressure and relentless artillery bombardment. Tom felt the strain in every muscle, the ache in his back, and the weight of responsibility for his comrades' lives. Yet he also felt a growing sense of determination. Each victory brought them closer to Rome and the ultimate goal of breaking through the German defensive lines. The battle was far from over. Monte Cassino itself remained a formidable challenge, its abbey perched high on the rocky hill, visible for miles. Tom knew that the coming days would demand every ounce of courage, skill, and endurance he possessed. The memories of North Africa and Sicily reminded him that perseverance could turn the tide, but Monte Cassino would test him in ways he could not yet imagine. As he looked out over the misty valleys, listening to the distant rumble of artillery and the cries of men fighting, Tom prepared himself for the next phase of the battle. The road to Rome was long, treacherous, and filled with uncertainty, but he had endured too much to falter now. With Harris beside him and comrades all around, he took a deep breath, steeling himself for the struggle that lay ahead. Monte Cassino loomed like a shadow over the valley below. From miles away, the abbey perched atop its rocky hill seemed untouchable, a monument to history and faith. But for Tom, it had become the symbol of relentless enemy resistance. Months of preparation had brought him to this point, yet nothing could have fully prepared him for the intensity of the battle to come. The Allied plan was brutal and precise. Artillery barrages rained down on the abbey and surrounding hills for hours, shaking the ground beneath Tom's boots. Dust, smoke, and stone filled the air, turning the morning sky into a gray haze. The roar of cannon fire became a constant companion, echoing through valleys and rattling nerves. Tom gritted his teeth, clutching his rifle, ready for the moment when he and his comrades would advance. The first assaults were chaotic. Narrow mountain paths funneled soldiers into exposed positions, while German defenders, well hidden in caves, bunkers, and ruined buildings, opened fire with deadly accuracy. Tom moved forward cautiously, using every piece of cover. Rocks, craters, fallen masonry. Tracer rounds streaked past him, and the smell of gunpowder hung thick in the air. Harris, ever by his side, kept spirits high with quick jokes, though the fear in his eyes betrayed the reality of the situation. Every village, every ridge, every stretch of open ground became a trap. Mortars fired from hidden positions, sending shockwaves through the trenches. Snipers perched in trees or behind crumbling walls picked off soldiers one by one. Tom learned to pause, observe, and anticipate enemy movements, often crawling inches at a time to avoid detection. Each advance was painstaking, measured, and fraught with danger. Civilians were caught in the crossfire, their homes shattered, streets reduced to rubble. Tom saw the devastation firsthand. Families huddled in basements, children clinging to parents, old men carrying what little they could salvage. In one village, a mother pressed a small loaf of bread into his hands before disappearing into the ruins. Tom accepted it quietly, aware that even in war, small acts of humanity persisted. The weather compounded the misery. Rain turned the slopes into slick mud, making every step a struggle. Soldiers slipped on rocks, fell into trenches, and dragged packs heavy with ammunition through waterlogged paths. Frostbitten fingers and aching muscles became routine. Yet despite exhaustion, Tom pushed forward. Each ridge secured, each village cleared, was a hard-won victory, a testament to the endurance and skill of his unit. The Germans fought with precision and desperation. Their defensive lines were intricate, using the terrain to their advantage. Artillery fire raked the valleys below, machine guns sprayed narrow streets, and snipers turned every crumbling wall into a deadly vantage point. Tom and Harris often worked in small teams, coordinating attacks, covering each other's movements, and clearing positions house by house. The abbey itself, though heavily damaged by Allied bombing, remained a formidable obstacle, its ruins concealing hidden defenders. Hours blurred into days. Sleep was scarce, limited to brief moments in shallow foxholes or behind rubble-strewn walls. Meals were minimal, often just hard biscuits and tinned rations. Water was rationed tightly, and every sip was savored. Tom developed a rhythm of endurance. Move, fire, rest briefly, move again. The constant pressure tested not only physical stamina but mental resilience, and every man carried the invisible weight of fear, grief, and hope. Amid the chaos, camaraderie held strong. Soldiers shared cigarettes, whispered stories from home, and offered quiet encouragement. Harris, with his relentless humor, helped keep spirits alive, but even he could not fully mask the fatigue and strain. Yet these small bonds, forged in the crucible of relentless combat, were lifelines. By mid-May 1944, the Allied forces made significant progress. Villages and ridges were slowly secured, the German lines gradually weakening under sustained pressure. Artillery, infantry, and air support coordinated to drive the defenders back, though each step forward remained costly. Tom felt the strain in every muscle, the ache of long marches and continuous combat, yet a quiet determination kept him moving. Finally, the breakthrough came. The abbey and surrounding hills fell to Allied forces after weeks of intense fighting. Tom stood on a ridge overlooking the valley, surveying the devastation. Shattered buildings, craters in the hills, and the exhausted figures of soldiers moving cautiously through the rubble. Relief mingled with sorrow. Victory had been achieved, but at a tremendous cost. The road to Rome was now open. Tom and his comrades pressed on, moving through towns devastated by war yet gradually liberated from enemy control. Each step brought them closer to the Italian capital, yet the psychological toll was heavy. Memories of lost friends, civilian suffering, and relentless combat weighed on him. Yet he also carried a renewed sense of purpose, the determination to see the campaign through to its conclusion. Monte Cassino would remain etched in Tom's memory as a testament to endurance, courage, and the relentless grind of war. The mountains had tested every limit, physical, mental, and emotional, but they had also forged a stronger, more resilient soldier. As the Allied forces moved toward Rome, Tom steeled himself for the battles yet to come, aware that each victory was merely a step toward the larger struggle that still awaited in Europe. After the grueling battles at Monte Cassino, Tom and his unit pressed onward toward Rome. The fall of the abbey had opened a path through the mountains, but the journey was far from easy. Roads were often destroyed or blocked by debris, bridges demolished, and towns left in ruins by retreating German forces. Every step brought new challenges, both physical and psychological, and the sense of anticipation was tempered by the knowledge that danger could strike at any moment. The countryside began to change. Rolling hills gave way to cultivated fields and vineyards, olive groves lined the roads, and small villages dotted the landscape. At first glance, it seemed serene, almost peaceful. But Tom knew better. German rearguards were everywhere, laying mines, booby traps, and hidden artillery. Patrolling along narrow roads required constant vigilance. One wrong step could trigger an ambush, and the men moved with a careful mix of speed and caution. The civilians they encountered were wary but hopeful. Some emerged cautiously from ruined homes, offering food or water, or simply a smile of encouragement. Others had fled to the countryside, leaving behind empty streets and shattered buildings. Tom noticed the contrast. A child playing in the dust of a destroyed piazza, an elderly man tending a small garden despite bombed-out walls surrounding him. These small glimpses of life amid destruction reminded him why they fought. The German defenders were strategic and disciplined, retreating methodically while leaving behind obstacles designed to slow the Allies. Snipers perched in windows, artillery rained down from elevated positions, and mines lay hidden along key roads. Tom and his comrades learned to approach every village as a potential battleground. Movement was deliberate, recon was essential, and every engagement required coordination and patience. Urban combat brought new challenges. Streets were narrow, buildings shattered, and alleys twisted like mazes. Clearing a single block could take hours, with enemy forces entrenched in basements, attics, or behind rubble. Tom and Harris often moved in small teams, checking each building methodically. The smell of smoke, dust, and cordite was constant, mixing with the odors of war, mud, blood, and the faint scent of scorched wood. During one memorable encounter in a bombed-out village on the outskirts of Rome, Tom discovered the resilience of civilians. A group of women and children had sheltered in the basement of a half-collapsed church. They offered Tom and Harris food, stale bread, a bit of cheese, and insisted they stay dry for a few moments. Tom accepted gratefully, feeling the profound impact of small acts of kindness amid chaos. Harris, ever cheeky, whispered, "Well, that's the nicest ambush we've had so far." Tom smiled, appreciating the brief reprieve. The push toward Rome was relentless. Artillery barrages softened German positions, while infantry advanced cautiously, clearing streets and securing buildings. Tanks moved through wider avenues, providing cover for advancing troops. Each step forward brought both relief and new tension. The enemy could strike from any corner, any doorway, any ruined building. Tom learned to trust his instincts, reading subtle signs of danger. A shutter slightly askew, a door swinging in the wind, a shadow that lingered too long. Supply lines continued to be a lifeline. Rations were basic, canned meat, biscuits, occasional vegetables, but they sustained the men. Water was precious, and Tom learned to cherish every sip, especially during the long marches under a blazing sun or the sudden downpours of autumn. Field kitchens worked tirelessly, preparing what they could while soldiers pressed forward, driven by the urgency of the advance. As the Allies approached Rome, German resistance began to waver. The city was heavily defended, but the strategic importance demanded that the Germans fall back to more defensible positions north of the capital. Tom's unit moved cautiously, aware of potential ambushes even as the enemy's strength diminished. Street by street, village by village, the Allied forces advanced, combining patience, precision, and determination to minimize casualties while securing key objectives. Finally, in early June 1944, Allied troops entered Rome. The city, scarred by war yet resilient, welcomed the soldiers with cautious celebration. Civilians emerged from basements, windows, and hidden alleys, offering food, cheers, and relief. Tom walked through streets lined with rubble, churches partially destroyed, and buildings bearing the marks of artillery fire. The atmosphere was surreal, victory tempered by the devastation that war had wrought. Tom allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. From the deserts of North Africa to the beaches of Sicily, the mountains of Italy, and now the streets of Rome, the journey had tested every limit of endurance, courage, and resolve. Friends had fallen, towns had been destroyed, and civilians had suffered, yet the march of progress continued. Harris clapped him on the shoulder, smiling despite dirt and exhaustion. "Well, Tommy boy, we made it. Rome's ours. For now." Yet the war was far from over. The German army, though weakened, was still retreating to defensive positions further north. Tom knew that new battles awaited. The rugged Apennine Mountains, fortified towns, and the relentless push through northern Italy. But for the first time in months, he felt a glimmer of hope, a sense that perseverance, courage, and unity could indeed change the tide of war. As he looked out over Rome from a vantage point atop a hill, Tom allowed himself a rare smile. The city was free, the path forward clearer, and the journey of survival and endurance had not been in vain. With Harris by his side and comrades around him, Tom prepared for the next chapter. New battles, new challenges, and the continuation of a war that had already tested him beyond measure. With Rome secured, Tom's unit turned their sights northward, toward the treacherous Apennine Mountains. The campaign through these rugged ranges would test soldiers in ways that no desert, beach, or urban street had before. Narrow mountain passes, steep ridges, and dense forests slowed their progress. Each day required careful planning, coordination, and physical endurance. The enemy, though retreating, used every natural advantage to delay the Allies. Winter approached, bringing rain, sleet, and the occasional snowfall. Mud turned roads into slippery traps, rivers swelled with runoff, and hypothermia became as real a threat as enemy fire. Soldiers slogged through the thick mud, boots waterlogged, clothes heavy and wet. Tom learned to move deliberately, resting briefly to preserve energy, rationing food and water, and maintaining vigilance against hidden threats. Every step required focus. A slip could lead to injury or worse. German forces had established fortified positions along the mountain ridges, utilizing stone houses, narrow valleys, and dense woodlands. Artillery fire from elevated positions rained down, shaking the ground and forcing Tom's unit to constantly adapt. Each village or ridge became a mini-battle, requiring coordinated assaults. Tom crawled through mud and underbrush, scanning for hidden machine guns, tripwires, and snipers. The Apennines demanded patience, precision, and courage. Civilians were caught in the turmoil once again. Families had fled to hidden caves or remote farms, leaving towns and villages eerily empty. Tom witnessed the resilience of those who remained. An elderly man tending a small flock despite shellfire, women fetching water along treacherous paths, and children peeking from ruined homes. These glimpses of human courage reminded him that even in war, life persisted. Supplies were stretched to the limit. Convoys moved cautiously along narrow mountain roads, often delayed by mudslides, enemy mines, or destroyed bridges. Rations consisted of hard biscuits, tinned meat, and the occasional fresh vegetable or loaf scavenged from local farms. Water was rationed carefully, and Tom learned to appreciate even the smallest comforts. A hot sip of tea, a bit of chocolate, or a brief rest under a tree when rain permitted. Combat was relentless. Each engagement demanded coordination, courage, and endurance. German soldiers used every natural advantage to inflict casualties and slow progress. Ambushes, sniper fire, and artillery barrages made every step a gamble. Tom and Harris often moved in small teams, clearing buildings, scouting paths, and providing cover for advancing troops. The Apennines were a battlefield of constant vigilance, requiring both skill and instinct to survive. Winter made everything worse. Frostbitten fingers, numb toes, and aching muscles were common among the men. Nighttime brought cold that seeped through clothing and blankets, turning every attempt at rest into a challenge. Soldiers huddled together for warmth, sharing meager blankets and whispering stories from home to ward off fear. Harris, despite his usual humor, shivered silently beside Tom, both men exhausted yet determined. Despite the harsh conditions, morale held. Small victories, a ridge captured, a village secured, or a supply line reestablished, brought brief relief and renewed determination. Soldiers shared cigarettes, told stories, and found moments of humor even in the darkest hours. Tom relied on these moments as lifelines, small reminders that perseverance and camaraderie could overcome almost any hardship. By February 1945, the Allies had made significant progress through the Apennines, though the German forces continued to resist fiercely. Each mile northward required careful planning, precise execution, and immense physical and mental endurance. Tom felt the strain in every muscle, every joint, but he also felt a growing confidence. The lessons learned in North Africa, Sicily, Rome, and earlier in Italy had forged him into a soldier capable of surviving and thriving in the most grueling conditions. The Apennines tested more than physical endurance. They tested patience, strategy, and resilience. Tom learned to read the terrain, anticipate enemy movements, and move with calculated precision. The mountains demanded respect, and the men adapted, becoming sharper, more alert, and increasingly reliant on each other. Every ridge taken was a small victory. Every village secured a step closer to final success. Amid the hardship, Tom found moments of reflection. Standing atop a frost-covered ridge, looking out over valleys blanketed in mist, he thought of home. Green fields, quiet streets, family he longed to see. These thoughts sustained him, a quiet anchor amidst the chaos of war. Harris nudged him gently, joking about their endless marching, and for a brief moment, laughter cut through the tension. The road north remained long and treacherous. The German army was retreating but skillfully, fortifying each position to slow the Allied advance. Tom knew that more battles awaited, mountain passes, river crossings, and fortified towns where every inch would be contested. Yet he also knew that each victory, each step forward, brought them closer to breaking the enemy's defenses and ending the long, bitter campaign in Italy. Spring arrived slowly in northern Italy, but the landscape offered little relief. The rivers swelled from melting snow, fields were muddy and churned by tanks and marching troops, and German defensive lines were reinforced with precision and tenacity. Tom and his unit pressed forward, aware that the final phases of the Italian campaign demanded both endurance and strategy. Every step northward was contested, and every river crossing could become a deadly bottleneck. The enemy had adapted. German forces established fortified positions along key riverbanks, bridges, and ridges. Machine guns were sighted to cover wide approaches. Snipers lurked in partially destroyed buildings, and artillery shelled any movement across open ground. Tom learned to approach each river, valley, or ridge with meticulous care. Reconnaissance became vital. He crawled along riverbanks, scanned the terrain with binoculars, and coordinated with engineers to assess crossing points. One wrong move could be fatal. Crossing the rivers was an ordeal. Some bridges had been destroyed, forcing soldiers to wade through icy waters, build temporary pontoons, or use small boats under fire. Tom felt the biting cold seep through his clothes as he helped fellow soldiers navigate currents, all while under sporadic fire from hidden enemy positions. Mud, debris, and the roar of artillery created a chaotic symphony of war. Yet each successful crossing brought relief and momentum. German defensive tactics were methodical. Rearguard units delayed advances with mines, ambushes, and barricades. Tom's unit frequently had to clear villages street by street, building by building, under relentless fire. One afternoon, advancing through a partially destroyed town, Tom spotted a German sniper in the remnants of a church tower. With Harris providing covering fire, he crawled across rubble-strewn streets, reaching a vantage point to neutralize the threat. Every engagement was a delicate dance between aggression and caution. Civilians remained both resilient and wary. Families emerged cautiously from ruined homes, offering small acts of kindness when possible. A loaf of bread, a jug of water, or directions through treacherous terrain. In one village, a young boy led Tom and Harris around a mined path, disappearing into the ruins without a word. These encounters, fleeting and fragile, reminded Tom that life persisted even amid relentless destruction. Supplies remained critical. Rations were still simple: tinned meat, biscuits, and the occasional fresh produce from liberated farms, but they were a lifeline. Water was rationed carefully, and soldiers treasured the occasional hot tea or soup. Field kitchens worked tirelessly to sustain troops moving quickly through the difficult terrain, and Tom learned to ration carefully while sharing what little he had with comrades. The psychological strain was relentless. Days blurred into nights filled with gunfire, artillery, and the constant demands of movement. Soldiers grew fatigued, muscles ached from long marches through mud and rivers, and sleep was sporadic at best. Tom often felt the weight of responsibility for his comrades, each decision carrying potential life or death consequences. Yet amidst the strain, camaraderie was unwavering. Harris's humor, whispered stories from home, and quiet encouragement from fellow soldiers provided moments of relief. The Allied push north was steady but cautious. Every ridge secured, every town liberated, and every river crossed represented a strategic advantage. Tom noticed the gradual weakening of German forces, retreating systematically to maintain defensive positions further north. The pattern was relentless: advance, engage, secure, regroup, and prepare for the next obstacle. The war had become a rhythm of tension and endurance, punctuated by brief victories that kept morale alive. By late spring, the Allies were pressing toward the Po Valley. German forces were stretched thin, defensive positions eroded by continuous artillery, infantry assaults, and the sheer momentum of the Allied advance. Tom and his unit moved cautiously, always aware that one misstep could trigger an ambush. Coordination with engineers, artillery, and fellow units became increasingly crucial to maintain progress. Amid the chaos, small moments of humanity persisted. Soldiers shared stories, offered cigarettes, and occasionally found time to play a brief card game or laugh at a shared memory. Tom cherished these moments, fleeting as they were, knowing that laughter and connection could be as vital as bullets and strategy. Every town liberated brought both relief and new challenges. Roads were often blocked with rubble, civilians required aid, and German rearguards occasionally staged counterattacks. Tom witnessed the physical and emotional toll of continuous combat on both soldiers and civilians. Yet he also saw courage, resilience, and the indomitable human spirit at work. By the time summer approached, the Allies had made significant inroads into northern Italy. Tom felt the strain in every muscle, the ache in his joints, yet he also sensed that the campaign's end was near. German forces were increasingly retreating, and the momentum of the Allied advance was undeniable. Each step forward brought the prospect of liberation. Each mile gained a testament to perseverance and determination. The sun rose weakly over northern Italy, casting pale light across fields scarred by months of relentless combat. Tom's unit pressed forward with a mixture of determination and exhaustion, knowing that the end of the campaign was near but aware that the final battles could be just as brutal as the first. German forces were retreating but leaving fortified positions, mines, and ambushes to delay the Allied advance. Every mile northward was earned through grit, patience, and coordination. The terrain grew increasingly complex. Rivers widened, valleys deepened, and the foothills of the Alps loomed ahead. Narrow mountain passes became choke points where a single mistake could halt progress or cost lives. Mud, rain, and swollen rivers added physical challenges, while enemy fire remained constant. Tom found himself crawling through mud-soaked fields, scaling rocky slopes, and moving cautiously along ridges under the vigilant eyes of snipers. Every step required focus, skill, and a clear mind. German rearguards proved resourceful. Mines lined bridges and roads, machine guns were concealed behind rubble and in trees, and artillery fired from hidden positions across valleys. Tom's unit often split into small teams for reconnaissance, clearing paths, and coordinating with engineers to dismantle obstacles. One morning, he crawled through a partially flooded gorge to assess a damaged bridge while Harris provided covering fire from above. The teamwork, precision, and trust between soldiers were vital to survival. The civilians were resilient and weary. Many had fled to remote villages or hidden in farmhouses, while others cautiously emerged from the ruins of bombed-out towns. Tom observed mothers carrying children along narrow paths, elderly men tending what remained of their farms, and families sharing the meager resources they could salvage. These glimpses of humanity amidst destruction reminded him of the war's ultimate stakes and reinforced the need for discipline, caution, and compassion. Supply lines remained crucial. Rations were minimal: hard biscuits, tinned meat, and the occasional fresh produce scavenged from liberated villages, but they sustained the men. Water was rationed carefully, and soldiers valued every sip, particularly during long marches under the sun or through rain-soaked passes. Field kitchens moved with remarkable efficiency, offering hot meals whenever possible, providing a momentary respite from the relentless grind of combat. Combat intensified in the foothills of the Alps. Narrow roads and mountain paths funneled troops into exposed positions, where German artillery and snipers targeted movement. Tom and his comrades had to coordinate carefully, using cover, timing, and precise fire to advance safely. Every village captured and every ridge secured required meticulous planning and relentless courage. The enemy, though retreating, fought with determination, unwilling to relinquish their positions without a struggle. Winter's lingering chill made movement even more taxing. Frost clung to uniforms, rivers were icy, and nights offered little warmth in makeshift shelters. Soldiers huddled together, sharing blankets, exchanging stories, and finding brief moments of humor to sustain morale. Harris, despite fatigue, continued to inject levity into grim moments, often whispering jokes or recounting absurd stories from their early campaigns. Tom, exhausted yet alert, leaned on these small interactions to maintain focus and resolve. As the campaign pressed on, the Allied forces gradually overwhelmed the remaining German defenses. Villages were secured, ridges captured, and river crossings completed with careful coordination. Tom witnessed the gradual collapse of resistance as the enemy fell back toward the northern passes and prepared for what would be their final stand in Italy. The march had been long and grueling, but each victory reinforced the strength, resilience, and cohesion of the soldiers who had endured months of continuous combat. Amid the chaos, moments of quiet reflection persisted. Standing atop a ridge, Tom observed the valleys below, dotted with the remnants of villages, fields churned by tanks and artillery, and soldiers moving cautiously through the landscape. He thought of home, of the fields and streets left behind, and of friends who had fallen along the way. These thoughts offered solace and renewed determination, anchoring him amidst the turbulence of war. By late spring 1945, the German army in northern Italy was in full retreat, consolidating in the Alps and preparing for surrender or evacuation. Tom's unit continued its pursuit, moving carefully through fortified towns, clearing remaining pockets of resistance, and aiding civilians wherever possible. The fatigue was palpable, yet the momentum of the Allied advance was undeniable. Every mile gained represented both a tactical victory and a step closer to ending the conflict. The final push was marked by intense coordination. Infantry, artillery, armor, and engineers working in unison to neutralize remaining obstacles. Tom experienced a mixture of exhaustion, exhilaration, and cautious optimism. The landscape, once a formidable challenge, gradually opened under their advance, and the retreating enemy became increasingly disorganized. It was a testament to months of perseverance, strategy, and courage that the campaign had come this far. The air in northern Italy carried a strange mixture of tension and relief. Tom's unit moved cautiously through the foothills of the Alps, yet the enemy's resistance had weakened. German forces, exhausted and depleted after months of relentless pursuit, were retreating, surrendering, or attempting to regroup in the mountainous terrain. The signs of war were everywhere. Towns scarred by artillery, bridges demolished, and villages emptied of their inhabitants. Yet there was also life. Civilians cautiously returning, tending fields and salvaging what remained of their homes. Tom's boots crunched over rubble and frozen mud as he advanced with Harris and the rest of his comrades. Every village cleared, every ridge secured, was a step closer to the inevitable conclusion. The months of desert, beach, mountain, and city combat had forged a rhythm of endurance. Constant vigilance punctuated by fleeting moments of relief and reflection. Each day demanded courage, patience, and adaptability, and Tom had learned to rely on instinct, training, and the unspoken bonds of brotherhood among soldiers. The final engagements were intense but brief. German soldiers, recognizing the futility of continued resistance, often surrendered when confronted with overwhelming force. Tom found himself escorting small groups of captives, disarmed but wary, their expressions a mixture of resignation and fear. It was a strange contrast to the men he had faced earlier, no longer the organized, methodical defenders of fortified positions, but weary individuals caught in the unraveling fabric of a losing war. Crossing the last few rivers and valleys before the Alpine passes, Tom witnessed acts of courage, desperation, and humanity alike. Civilians offered food, blankets, and guidance, sometimes risking their lives to aid soldiers navigating dangerous terrain. In one small village, an elderly woman pressed a steaming loaf of bread into his hands and whispered, "For the boys who fight for us." Tom accepted it quietly, touched by the gesture, the warmth of her care cutting through the cold, muddy reality of war. The soldiers celebrated small victories, though the cost of months of relentless combat weighed heavily. Friends lost, towns destroyed, and the constant presence of death left an indelible mark. Yet there was also camaraderie, humor, and shared resilience. Harris, ever the joker, whispered absurd observations, and for brief moments, laughter echoed across the ruins of battle-scarred villages. These fleeting moments were precious, reminders that even amidst devastation, human connection endured. By late spring 1945, German forces in northern Italy were in full retreat or surrender. Allied command coordinated the final advances carefully to minimize casualties and secure liberated territory. Tom's unit moved steadily, clearing the remaining towns, ensuring safe passage for civilians, and assisting in rebuilding efforts wherever possible. The landscape, once dominated by fortifications, trenches, and mines, gradually transformed under the steady hand of recovery and liberation. When the final surrender occurred, a profound mix of relief, exhaustion, and quiet triumph washed over the soldiers. Tom stood amidst his unit, surveying the valley below, scattered with remnants of war. Destroyed vehicles, shattered buildings, and the exhausted figures of both soldiers and civilians. Silence fell briefly, a pause in the relentless rhythm of conflict, as if the land itself were exhaling after months of tension. Tom reflected on the journey. From the burning sands of North Africa to the Sicilian beaches, the mountains of Italy, the streets of Rome, and finally the northern valleys and alpine foothills, the war had demanded every ounce of endurance, courage, and resilience. Friends had fallen, civilians had suffered, and every step had carried the weight of life and death. Yet through it all, he had learned the power of persistence, the importance of camaraderie, and the enduring spark of humanity amid chaos. Harris clapped him on the shoulder, a grin under layers of mud and grime. "We actually made it, Tommy, against all odds." Tom nodded, feeling the truth in the words. Victory had come at a high cost, but it had come nonetheless. The Italian campaign was over, yet its lessons, scars, and memories would remain forever etched in the hearts and minds of those who survived. As Tom watched the sun set over the valleys of northern Italy, painting the mountains in gold and crimson, he allowed himself a rare moment of peace. The battles were done, the enemy defeated, and the long, arduous march of endurance and survival had finally reached its conclusion. Yet in the quiet, he also felt the weight of loss, the memories of fallen comrades, and the lingering uncertainty of what lay ahead. War had shaped him, tested him, and left its mark, but it had also revealed the resilience, courage, and humanity that endured even in the darkest hours. Tom knew the world beyond Italy awaited, with new challenges, new responsibilities, and the hope for lasting peace. But in this moment, standing amidst the ruins and triumphs of a long and grueling campaign, he simply allowed himself to breathe, to remember, and to acknowledge that, against all odds, they had survived, and in surviving, they had forged a story of endurance, courage, and humanity that would never be forgotten.